This video is part of a series for Everyday Feminism, a website dedicated to helping you stand up to and break down everyday oppression. 2015 has been an amazing year for the LGBTQIA+ community. With the national passing of marriage equality and the growing representation of trans people in film and television, I think it's fair to say that while we may still have a long way to go, we've come very far. But in order to understand just how far we've come, we have to recognize where we used to be. At the turn of the 20th century, the low rent and the ethnic diversity of Greenwich Village, New York, made it a haven for artists of all types. The Village, as it's called, is located between Houston and 14th Street and from the Hudson River to Broadway. Nonconformity was in vogue, radicalism was tolerated, and experimental theater thrived alongside large Broadway productions. However, while the Village flourished, the state of New York was struggling to keep up. Sodomy laws made homosexual acts illegal, and they overwhelmingly targeted homosexual men who at that point were called homophiles. Sodomy laws had been consistently in reform since the 19th century, and by the 1950s, the punishment for sodomy had been reduced to a misdemeanor. However, anti-gay policies and the raiding of known gay establishments still persisted. The Managing Society is the oldest known homophile organization in the United States. In 1966, the New York Managing Society hosted a sit-in at Julius Bar on West 10th Street in Greenwich Village to protest the New York State Liquor Authority's anti-gay laws. The law stated that it was illegal for homosexuals to congregate and to be sold alcoholic beverages. These laws resulted in the closing of several gay bars in New York, and in order for them to stay afloat, they had to rely on paying bribes to police and the mafia. The Managing Society sit-in led to the end of SLA laws, and there was a shift in the landscape of New York. People began to express their sexualities and their genders more openly. However, the police and the fire department did not comply with the change in laws, and unfortunately several bars were still raided. At this point, there were gay bars that were now operating legally, but there were also places like the Stonewall Inn that technically was illegal and unlicensed. Stonewall was known as a bar that no one liked, but everyone frequented. It was where you went when you were too young or too poor to go anywhere else. It was a seedy little bar with no fire exits, no plumbing, and watered-down liquor. Stonewall was a haven for queer runaways, and it was one of the few places where you could go and express yourself freely in the Village. At that point in time, not only were there liquor restrictions, but you couldn't even be seen appearing to be in a homosexual relationship. That meant that dancing was absolutely out of the question. But Stonewall was known to have the best dance floor in town. Drag queens ran the jukebox, and the crowd was mostly working class people of various genders, racial backgrounds, and sexualities. One of the most well-known patrons was Greenwich Village icon Marsha P. Johnson, who was a drag performer, sex worker, and trans woman. Her close friend was Sylvia Rivera, a 17-year-old Puerto Rican trans woman who also was a sex worker who performed drag. Stormy DeLavery could also be found at the dingy bar at 53 Christopher Street. She was a mixed black woman, a drag king, and a self-identified dyke who was often referred to as the guardian of the lesbians in the Village. Miss Major Griffin Gracie was a community leader for transgender rights, specifically for trans women of color. Most bars at the time denied entry to trans women, but as Miss Major established herself in the community, she no longer had to explain herself. Stonewall was run by the mafia and relied on bribes to the police to keep the regular raids at bay. Sometimes, however, the bars were raided because the police simply wanted a larger paycheck. Seymour Pine was a deputy inspector with the NYPD, and he was determined to have the bar closed down. On June 24, 1969, he raided the bar, confiscated the alcohol, and arrested several of the personnel. The bar's owner yelled at him defiantly that they'd be open the next day. On June 28, 1969, around 1 a.m., he returned with a search warrant. He was accompanied by representatives of city and federal agencies to observe the raid. That night, Marsha was celebrating her birthday with Sylvia, and she was disappointed at the lackluster turnout for her celebration. When the police entered, Sylvia shrieked, believing that she had forgotten her ID, but her friend Gary had brought it with him. The way that these raids would work is that they'd ask the bar's patrons to line up, and one by one they'd check identification. The police would basically look for any excuse possible to arrest a patron inside of the bar. A common infraction that specifically targeted trans people and drag performers was the rule that you had to have at least 4 pieces of gender-appropriate garb. Sylvia was nervous, but she wasn't expecting any harassment. After all, that night she only had a little bit of makeup on. The police came and grabbed her ID out of her hand and asked her with a smirk on their face, whether or not she was a boy or a girl. It was at that point where Sylvia had it and almost swung at an officer, but was held back by her friend Gary. The patrons at the Stonewall Inn had become so accustomed to these raids that, at this point, they were just taking it in jest. As drag queens and some of the more colorful patrons left, they began to strike poses in front of the bar for people passing by. But when a paddy wagon pulled up, and the police started moving arrested patrons into it, the mood changed. People started pushing the paddy wagon, and the police yelled at them to get back. The mood kept shifting, and there was a foreboding presence, like something was about to happen. The definitive point of that night was when Stormy Delivery was taken out of the bar and put into a control wagon after fighting with 4 police officers. She screamed at the onlookers, "Why don't you do something?" desperately wondering how clear acts of police brutality could go without uproar. From that point, the crowd erupted. Marsha P. Johnson is said to have been the first person to throw a shot glass at the police. Some Stonewall veterans refer to it as the shot glass heard around the world. Sylvia Rivera is said to have thrown a bottle at police officers. Bar patrons and people in the community started pelting the police with stones, and civil disobedience erupted into Christopher Street. Most famously, a kick line of drag queens formed and sung, "We are the Stonewall Girls, we wear our hair in curls, we don't wear underwear, we show our pubic hair," before assaulting officers with any piece of the bar that they could find. The Stonewall Riots meant many things to many people. People that were there describe it as an event that finally allowed them to vent their anger. Street kids who had nothing to lose and gender-variant people were largely responsible for the uprising. Miss Major was arrested after being intentionally knocked out by a police officer to further avoid injury, a strategy she had learned from other queens. The Stonewall Riots continued on for a few days and sparked the foundation for LGBTQIA+ rights and activism. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson went on to create STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, a group dedicated to helping homeless drag queens and trans women. A militant group called the Gay Liberation Front was formed and stood in contrast to the nonviolent approach of the Managing Society. Miss Major became an advocate for incarcerated trans women, and to this day she still advocates for that cause. Stormy Delivery became an active member of the Stonewall Veterans, and had a film about her life released in 1987 about her life in America's first integrated drag review. The Stonewall Riots are celebrated every year on June 28th on Christopher Street Liberation Day. And this became the start of what we call Gay Pride. 4 years after the riots, Sylvia Rivera got on the stage during Gay Pride at the Gay Liberation Rally to represent STAR. She was heckled and booed while trying to speak out about trans women and gender-variant individuals who were often targeted for sexual violence in prison. While she gave an empowering speech, she left feeling disempowered, and she slipped away from activism for the next 20 years. While accounts of that evening vary, there is one consistent part of the narrative, that trans women, drag queens, and people of color played a large part of the events that evening. In September of this year, a film directed by Roland Emmeric and written by John Robin Baitz about Stonewall will be in theaters. And the star of the film isn't Sylvia, or Marsha, or Storm, or Miss Major, but a fictional cis white male protagonist named Danny Winters, who is credited as the man who threw the first brick at Stonewall. In part 2, I'll be giving my criticism of the trailer, and it may not be exactly what you think. But for now, Cat Blaque for Everyday Feminism. Signing out. If you like this video, support me on Patreon to get access to exclusive vlogs. The general response to my internal biases video was, look, I'm cis and I'm white and I'm tired of supporting minorities and being told that I'm a jerk. It's like you people will just never be happy. You know what?